Hi, this is Henning from FlippedNormals.com, and in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you a really cool tip for texturing all sorts of characters. This is particularly useful when it comes to something that has scales or very leathery skin, which you just have to spend a lot of time sculpting up in ZBrush. Instead of sculpting this from scratch, using techniques like this where we just kind of eyeballing things, we can be using image maps and texture maps to really make this a lot easier. One of the problems with this approach that I'm currently doing, although not very well, is that it becomes very inorganic, where it just becomes not very pleasant to look at. Real life has a lot more variety to it. So if you're texturing something like this dinosaur, you don't just want this kind of stuff to be hand drawn on top. By utilizing a texturing software like Painter or Mari, we can really get a lot more variety in our Sculpt, which we can then use to add additional details to our actual texture maps when it comes to the pure texturing process. So this video here is going to have three parts. The first part is going to be grading photos in Photoshop. The second part is going to be projecting the photos in Painter. And the third part is going to be sculpting this in ZBrush. So stay tuned for that. Before we get into the video, this asset is provided by Damien, who's an absolutely fantastic artist. This asset here specifically is available on FlippedNormals.com, so you can buy this asset yourself, support Damien, and you can check out how this is made. The version we're using in this video is the low poly version of this, and of course the whole thing comes with a ZBrush file and all the texture maps. So this is a very professional asset, which is how Damien has been working in VFX. So the first step is going to be to grade photos. The reason we want to grade photos instead of just projecting these directly on top in Painter is that there is way too much information here. There is color information, and we haven't really graded this in any way. Also, the image is too large as well. So in this case, we want to just go through and first just crop the image. Now we're using Photoshop here, but you can really use any image editor. What we're doing here is dead simple. Then we are just going to make a duplicate of this just to be sure we don't destroy it. And then we're going to turn this into black and white. And this is where you can start to grade this up just a little bit. The images we're using here are really low quality images. And that doesn't really matter a whole lot, because what we're doing now is we're just going to be using this as a base for sculpting. Though it's of course a good idea to start to grade these as much as you can. Really try to get the creases in here. This is what we really want. We really want to be sure that we have as much contrast and that the creases are as visible as possible. Sometimes I'll even go in here and I'll straight up just paint out certain areas if this here is too strong. So I'll just like paint out certain areas like this because I just want to have some nice information. And then once we've done this, we can take the whole thing, Control-Shift-Alt-E, one hell of a mouthful, and then we can duplicate this a few more times. The goal with this is that we're going to turn this into a high pass that we can blur a little bit. So filter, other, high pass, and then you can see what this does. If you were to set this to a very low value, you get really a neutralized version where it's going to turn it into 50% gray and really give you this really lovely quality here, which is a lot nicer than what you would have normally, right? Like between this and this, it's just a lot easier to texture. Another advantage of this approach is that all the images are going to have a similar grade. So the midpoint is going to be similar. So we can just turn this into this, and then we are going to be duplicating this a few times. So this one here is going to be, first one here is going to be blurred just a little bit. So we're just going to go to blur, filter, blur, and then we're just going to go and set this to Gaussian blur. We want to just blur this to just tiny amount. Like maybe like how much you blur it is entirely based on how large the image is. We take the other one and we blur this less, and then we're going to be setting this to overlay. So just blur this less. If you have a picture that's like 3000 pixels, this obviously needs to be blurred a lot more, but this is a pretty low res picture. So now we can set this to overlay, and the advantage of this approach is that we get even more details out of this. So if we were to compare this to this, we just have a lot more details. What you often find is that if you start to project something that's too detailed like this, you just get noise. So you usually have to blur this a little bit more. Then we can just set this here on top, and we can just blur this a little bit less, or you can see what happens if we just put this to overlay as well. You can see that it gets sharp, but it gets too sharp. So we can just take this here, we can just blur this, and then we can just set this to something like 0.2. just so we get just a little bit more details out of this. So you can see how much more info we get out of this than before. And then we are just going to be saving this out. And then we're just going to be doing this with a few more pictures, but you know, the process is exactly the same. So I'm just going to be skipping ahead a little bit here. What we want with these pictures is not so much the pure textural detail. We really want just the organic nature of it. So it's really tempting to try to grade these to a crazy amount so you can use this right away. But I find it to be very useful to just think about this as we just want a pattern, because then we just have reference. It really doesn't matter too much about the quality of this. And you can see by high passing this, you really get a lot more details out of this. You can kind of get rid of a lot of the highlights and shadows this way. The exact values just varies based on what you want. And then we're just going to do the same thing as before. So back in Painter, let's import these guys simply by dragging them into the asset library. Then we select all three of them, set this to texture, and just import this into the current project. Then we're just going to be dealing with the color map for now. This would technically kind of be the height, but it doesn't really matter because we are just using this as an entirely temporary map. So we are just going to make a fill layer first, and this should only be set to color. We're just going to be sure that this here is set to 50% gray. Doesn't really matter a whole lot, but you know, we can just set this to 50% gray. And then we are going to create a new paint layer, and we can just call this projection. So projection there. And then we are going to go into our projection tool, and we are just going to go all the way to the bottom here. And then we are going to be dragging one of them into the base color slot. And now you can see we have our color. Now, this is where you just have to be a little bit vigilant when it comes to this. You just have to spend proper time on this just to be sure that we have something that's going to work properly. So we are just going to start to project this onto our leg. We're just going to be doing the leg for now. This is not going to be perfect, but it's going to show you the process of this. So just painting this on top of this. And this is the advantage of this approach, that first you can see how fast you get coverage like this, but also because it's going to be organic. So we can just go through here with the projection tool, just do this from a few different angles. And of course, where it breaks, you're just going to have to go through and fix that. A disadvantage of this approach is that you can't really warp it, right? Like in some software, you can actually warp this kind of stuff. So you can properly get in and get all the details you want in specific spots. You can really like blend things together. You can't really do that in Painter, but that's okay. You know, if you just have to be a little bit more conscious of what you're doing. So I'm not really thinking too much about exactly how this stuff here connects. It's fine if it's not. This is just for a quick demo, but this should hopefully show you the potential of this workflow. So we can just start to connect these things up. You can just check this in the color slot as well, right here. Now you can see what this actually looks like. And then we can go under and use a different image. Just drag this in under here, and we can just see that we can just play around with the different images. So just going through here and just projecting another picture on top of this, which we just graded. So again, this is going to be a little bit bootleg in terms of like the actual quality of it, the final quality, but it's hopefully going to show you the approach to this. We can do the final image as well, just to get some coverage over this. And don't be too concerned with actually painting across the UDIMs here. Like the Painter supports UDIMs, you shouldn't really be concerned with that. This is going to cause issues in ZBrush like we just mentioned, but that's something we will deal with in ZBrush. So just painting this across and just trying to blend this a little bit. Then we're just going to be dragging another one in. This is going to be the first one again. And just now that we have some feedback here, we can just start to play around with this. I always found it to be a little bit confusing how the projection tool worked in terms of the navigation, but it's very simple. You know how we have Alt, left mouse button, and zooming and navigation, all that. It's exactly the same for pictures here, just that we use the S key instead of the Alt key. So that's how that kind of made sense for me, because I had to constantly look up the hotkeys for the projection tool. So there we go. You can now see that we get some good details in this. Now, as a little bonus tip, this is actually an area where Mari really excels. So if you don't know Mari, totally fine. this is just a little bonus tip, where the advantage of using Mari for this is that you can actually warp things. What I mean by that is you can project something like this, which is exactly the same as in Painter, apart from the fact that you can now move this around, which is great. So this is in a paint buffer, so you have a lot more control in this way, but you can also warp this around. So you can go in here and you can select one of these guys, so you can just warp this around like so. So you have a lot of control. You can increase this, so you can really start to get in here, and then you can bake this down, and then we can just go into another one here, and we can start to just warp this around in a different way. So the Mari is a fantastic tool for this. For this kind of stuff, Mari is, I think, much, much better than Painter, but pros and cons, right? It's not better for everything, but just for this kind of stuff specifically, I definitely prefer to use Mari for this. You do of course have the warp project in Painter as well. You can make a fill layer, set this to warp project right here, warp projection, and then you can drag one of these guys into the color slot right here. But the problem with this is you need one layer per thing, right? Like per projection. So that's going to just create a lot of layers, and it's nowhere near as flexible. But you know, this is an approach you could take if you want. If you want this texture right here, you could of course do that as well. You can go in, edit vertices, place this down, snap this to the surface. This is going to work, and this is going to give you a lot of freedom, but becomes quite cumbersome when it comes to actually doing this kind of stuff in a real projection. Like if you're doing this character here, you would probably need like up to 100 projections, because you just keep working with this. So that's really it for the Painter part. I'm just going to spend a little bit more time on this off camera, just to be sure this looks a little bit nicer, because this is a little bit bootleg at the moment. So I'm just going to be making sure this works a little bit better. All right, cool. So we have an area here that's working all right now. This is not perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect. This can be quite dirty, to be perfectly honest, because we are going to be sculpting this. So now we are going to simply export this out. For this, we only need the color map as well. So this is the only thing we're exporting. This should also only be 8-bit, because the original images are 8-bit. And honestly, the original images are kind of crappy anyway, so there isn't really a whole lot of data in there. Then we just hit export. And here we have all the images, and that's a lot of images because this character here has 24 UDIMs. So if we could just go to view, and then we just go to details, you can now see that they're all basically 17 kilobytes, which means that all of these guys here, they're not really doing anything apart from these two, which have more data, which means that there just is not going to be any data on them, which means they haven't been painted on. So we can just safely take all these guys and just delete them. And then we are going to go to ZBrush. Now in ZBrush, here is our model. This is around 2.3 mil, which is going to be subdivided to around 9 million. The workflow is now really that we are going to be importing these images in, and then we are going to be sculpting on top of these ones. So we are going to go under texture, import. Then we're going to find these pictures. We're going to take this one here, which there seems to be the most stuff going on, import. Now, the trick here is you have to flip this, because ZBrush is ZBrush, and every single picture you import or export, you have to flip as well. The same if you're going under multi-map exporter, you have to flip on export. So flip on import, flip on export. Then we go under texture map, and then we can now just add this here. And now you can see that this indeed puts this in the correct spot. But the problem is that it puts it everywhere, because ZBrush doesn't support the importing of UDIMs. So that's a problem. How do we solve this? Well, we can't really solve this, to be perfectly honest, because it doesn't accept importing of UDIMs. So if you're working on a character with a lot of UDIMs like this, what you just have to do is you just have to work on one UDIM at a time. So if you want to work on this place, you have to just import this picture, this image map, and then you work on this part, you import this texture map as well. So the way you can work with this so it's not confusing, and so you can actually see where it's importing, is that you can just go to the lowest subdivision level. It's going to make it easier. Then we go to polygroups. Then we hit UV groups. And what this is going to do, this is going to provide us with a polygroup based on the UDIMs. So now you can just Control-Shift-Click on this polygroup here, and now you can see that we only have this UDIM selected, which means that, you know, this is the only thing we have. So this makes it a lot easier to work with this. Now, before we do any kind of sculpt or anything silly like that, we are going to just make a new layer on top. So just hit new layer, and we can just call this projection. What you could do now is you could straight up start sculpting. this is the gist of this workflow, that you're now sculpting this up, because now you can see the patterns. This is a lot of manual work, of course, but you can really see the patterns in this approach. And remember what we did in the beginning, where we just kind of sculpted kind of what we felt like? We just kind of did this kind of stuff. This is what this fixes, because now we get these really nice organic patterns, which in theory would of course be over the whole body. But an additional trick to this is that we can import this as a displacement map. But the way we can import a displacement map is we can go to Alpha, Import, and select the map here as well. And then we simply go under Alpha again with the selected and flip V. And then we can find this right here. And now if you start to enable the disp map here, just set this to a very low value, 0.2 maybe. Let's see how this goes. That's way too strong, 0.02. And we can just start to see that something has been happening here. So we probably need to add an additional 0.02 here. 0.2, just so we don't kill our system. And now you can start to see that we actually get this projected onto it. And this is where we need to be sure that we are in a layer like this, or in a selection mode like this. We don't apply this everywhere, and we need a layer as well, because this is going to cause some seams. Then we hit apply this map, and now all this is going to be applied onto this. So now what we can do is we can just disable the texture map, and you can see we actually have some sculpting in here, right? We actually have something like a bit of a basis. But just what we have to be sure of is that when we go out of the polyframe, that we don't have any seam going around this. It's very easy to get seams if you're not careful. And then we can go over this whole thing, and we can just start to smooth this. We can just go over with the smooth brush, set this to low intensity, and this is just blurring it. So if you blur this enough in Photoshop, you can go through and you have to blur this less. And then we can just go through here and we can just start to sculpt this. This is a really powerful workflow, because we can now just go through here with something like the Alpha 06 and just sculpt on top like so, and just really go over this and just create really nice sculpted details. And one of my main theses for sculpting, for creating textures and just creating good characters, is that the sculpting is the master. Meaning that if you're trying to texture something or look at something or make something look nice that has insufficient details, meaning that the stuff here just isn't good enough, it's going to be really, really difficult to get something nice, simply because you're missing a very, very important part of it. And on the other side, if this is done to a very high level, meaning that you have really nicely sculpted details, texturing becomes not too difficult. It's always difficult to texture a dinosaur, right? Like this, that's just inherently a challenge. But if you're deliberate about this, then you can use this here as a basis for a curvature, cavity, ambient occlusion map. And you can often get away with just using simple gradients for your texture map. Of course, you need a lot more than just simple gradients, but as a starting point, that works very well. I find that if a model is under sculpted, basically if the model is under modeled, it becomes very, very, very difficult to texture it. But if a model is kind of over modeled almost, where this kind of stuff is really, really carefully done, then it becomes so much easier to texture it. So it's not just good enough to go through here and go over with the damn standard. You have to add volume to this as well. Otherwise, we're just going to be carving things around this. So what you can do is you can go over with the clay brushes. I find that the clay buildup is decent for this, but if there's too much variety within each scale, it can go a little crazy. And this is where the clay brush, the regular clay brush, is really good as well. So you can just go over this, just decrease the intensity a little bit, and you can just go over this. And I also find it to be quite useful to use just smooth brush inside of each one of these scales, because this way you're really just creating a stronger shape. So I'm just going to be spending some time now just going over this, just creating a slightly better base. And you can just see my approach for this. It's all manual at this point. You could, of course, do this without the grading and the projection in Mari/Painter, but this just means that it's a lot more mindless, to be honest. You can just kind of put on some headphones and just listen to a good podcast or something like that while doing this, and you don't really have to think too much about it. And the problem with not doing it like this, the problem with sculpting this entirely just based on kind of our human instinct, is that it just gets very rigid, or it just looks very man-made instead of this that would look really nice and organic. You can also just enable the texture map as well if you want to see some more details like this. Then sometimes you just need to see more details because they didn't translate particularly well. So I sometimes prefer to go over this like this, just really carving in the details based on what I'm seeing, and then I'm integrating this later on. And for areas like this where we kind of go between two maps, it's not really a problem either, because it's where you can use your intuition and you can start to just sculpt this and kind of re-sculpt it based on what you think would work. So if you have areas that haven't been perfectly projected, in this case, we spent like only a few minutes on the actual projection, it's not going to be perfect. But even if you spend a proper good time on this, it's not going to be perfect. So you can just go through this and then just fix this by hand like so. So it's definitely a big benefit to sculpting this kind of stuff by hand, just with the texture map enabled as well. And then once you're done with this UDIM, you just move on to the next UDIM. This is why I don't really think it's a huge problem that ZBrush doesn't support UDIMs for this. It would be absolutely fantastic if it did, but that hasn't happened yet. So maybe it will never happen. But since you're spending so much time on each part, this is not really a huge concern, particularly like if you're spending like 2 hours on each part here, an hour on each part, if you have to spend 2 minutes replacing the UDIM, it's honestly fine. This might be something you only do for the most hero parts as well of the mesh, because you might not have the poly count for this for the whole area, or or the patience for it. Some of this you probably just want to do procedurally in a texturing software as well. But the goal is that we're getting coverage over everything now. You just have to check without the texture as well, because otherwise you're going to rely way too much on texture, and you just need to see this in a more organic fashion. Still trying to be a bit gestural about this, it's trying to make sure that there is a bit of flow between these scales and not making sure that they don't just seem like single scales. There needs to be some unity with it. And that's one of the advantages of using this technique, where we can really go through and sculpt this kind of stuff up, because using pictures. Because if you do this by hand, again, like we mentioned before, then it's going to feel very much like individual scales instead of some nice unity that you really get with these photos. And obviously the more time you spend grading and finding good reference, the easier it is going to be as well, because right now we have pretty crappy photos, but I kind of think that's cool as well. I want to show you how you can actually get away with using crappy photos instead of absolutely perfect reference, because in reality, whenever you're sculpting or creating any kind of character like this, most likely you're going to have pretty mediocre reference, because that's what you can find, right? Or maybe that's what your client provided you with. So if this was perfect reference, then you would be dealing with something like texturing XYZ or surface mimic, and then you don't really have to do a lot of what we're doing now. Then you can straight up project this in a texturing software, and then it's going to work pretty much out of the box. But then you're also reliant on those texture maps. If you want something highly specific, it's really hard to do that if you rely on those specific maps, because maybe the dinosaur or the crocodile or whatever you're creating doesn't look like those pre-made texture maps. This is something you can do as well if you've been provided a concept by a client as well, where they might have a highly specific texture or something that they want to have in like on the model. Maybe a concept artist has made that and you have to translate that. You can straight up project this on top of your mesh and then just start to sculpt this up. It's a very powerful approach, straight up taking the best of both worlds, best of the image map approach and the best of this approach. In some cases, you don't even have to sculpt this. In some cases, you can just kind of get away with doing this directly in Painter. If you have good enough pictures, then you might get away with that. The best thing is, of course, if you have your own reference, because then you're going to have so much more resolution. So now we have a base of this. Let's just start to clean this up a little bit, like so. I'm just going to go over this. This is where you probably need more resolution. In this case, we're at around almost 10 million polys, or 9.3, and you can see we're running out of juice, but at the same time, we're also looking at this crazy close-up, right? Where you have to zoom out and see, well, are we going to be seeing this character this close-up? If no, if you're going to be seeing at this level, this is actually fine because you can't see the polygons here. But if you have some crazy close-up shot like this, you'll probably need a lot more polygons than this. Sometimes you even have to split the model up. This is what we had to do for some of the movies I worked on, where we had to really split up the model because we just couldn't get enough resolution. And don't do that. Don't split your model up unless you really have to. That becomes incredibly annoying to deal with, particularly if you're dealing with any kind of pipeline that you most likely will be doing if you're working that high poly. What you can also do, instead of just grading the photos, this is something I've done a few times, is you straight up just draw on top of the photos in Photoshop. You just create a black mask where you have the lines around it, and then you just project this on top. This can work really well as well, because then you have no noise whatsoever in the sculpting, in the scales, in the details you're getting in. But obviously it takes a lot longer as well. But if you are going to be doing a project like this, it's going to take quite a lot of time to get this right, then it's worth spending a few hours grading photos. Every second you spend grading photos is like 2 seconds you're getting back. I would always do this when I was in production in the film industry, that whenever I start a new character, I would just spend a lot of time grading photos. Particularly if you're spending months on it, then it's just a massive benefit to that. So we've kind of done the outer now, and we added some volume to it, but now we can go through here and we can just go through and add some like life into each specific scale. Again, we're quite low poly now, but so we probably won't want an additional subdivision level, but yeah, this can work quite well. I'm also just trying to make the scales more separate. This should still be gestural like we talked about, but just going through this and making sure that they do feel separate is going to help a lot. It's going to help a lot when it comes to the rest of the texturing, because now it's a lot easier to create masks for this, for instance. So what you can do, for instance, is you can bring this back into Painter as a displacement map, and then you could almost like bucket fill it, like around these ones here, if you're careful enough. You can't actually bucket fill this. I don't think that would work, though, unless you might be able to create some script for that. But at least you kind of like draw within the lines. So you can create different roughness values for this, or just different color values based on this. I'm sure somebody smart has made a designer script or something for exactly that. So yeah, that's really how you be working with this. You can see here that quite quickly we've created a pretty nice and organic texture like so. This is not perfect in any way, but we've also haven't been working on this for a very long time. So the steps are really find good pictures, find good images, grade them in Photoshop or whatever image editor you want to, using a high pass and a blur. Save them out, try to match them to each other as well. So this is they're a little bit more consistent. Then you're projecting them in Painter or Mari or any other texturing software. And then you can now go through and apply this in ZBrush, actually apply the displacement map, and then you can sculpt this up as well. This is a fantastic approach for doing this kind of work, particularly if you're doing something that you already have direct photo ref for. You don't have that for a dinosaur like this, obviously, because doesn't really exist, though of course you could have maybe museum models. But if you're doing something like a lizard or a crocodile that you can have one-to-one reference with, then you can line those up using cameras or just projecting them on top, and that's going to work very well. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found this to be really useful. We have tons of really cool training and resources on FlippedNormals.com, like this Introduction to Anatomy course recently released, or a full masterclass showing you how to create this whole character from scratch. So check out FlippedNormals.com if you want tutorials and awesome resources, and we'll see you in the next video.